Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Missouri. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the spring of 1895, the air around northern Missouri was still heavy with the scent of thawing mud and chimney smoke when the Holloway family took possession of a neglected property near a small township called Benton Creek. The parcel, barely 8 acres, included a barn sagging with rot, a root cellar, and an unusually deep stone well said to date back before the war between the states. The previous owners, the Pratt family, had left quietly 2 years prior, following what townspeople later called unhappiness. No public record mentioned why, only a brief note in the county ledger: property vacated for health reasons. The Holloways, Elias, his wife Margaret, and his younger brother Henry, were not considered an ordinary trio. Elias was a stoic man, 38, once a cooper by trade, who had returned from St. Louis after the great storms of the previous summer destroyed his small workshop. Their arrival coincided with quiet talk of unsettled weather, failed crops, and whispers about the old Pratt well. Records at the county office in Moberly mention an inspection ordered after several cattle from a neighboring farm had gone missing. The official notes, signed by Deputy Surveyor Alton Briggs, simply stated, "Waterline deeper than expected, possible cavern extension, no action taken." The Holloways restored the house modestly, boarding up one window and setting new hinges on the front door. Margaret was said to be frail but kind, often leaving bread by the roadside for travelers. Henry, barely 30, was different, withdrawn, sometimes found speaking to himself near the orchard fen. See it on April 9, 1895. Local constable Benjamin Rourke was called to the property after a boy named Peter Grady reported seeing a light shining from inside the well. Rourke's report, preserved in fragment in the Randolph County Archives, describes the scene: a dim glow, like lantern reflection, observed at depth, though no flame seen. Later that night, Margaret recorded in her small ledger, now part of the historical collection in Jefferson City, "Elias is restless again. The sound from below returned tonight. It hums softly, like wind through boards, but comes from stone." A week later, the Holloways ceased attending church. Services at the First Methodist noted their absence by May 5th. Reverend Callan visited and found the house quiet, doors latched from within. He later testified to the county board, "No voices, no livestock, no smoke from the chimney. I feared sickness." By June, rumors reached Moberly that the Holloways had either moved west or fallen ill. Yet an entry in a supply ledger from Bell Nix Mercantile dated June 14th recorded a delivery to E.H., well rope, 2 lanterns, kerosene, 3 canvas sheets. No further transactions followed. That same summer, newspapers in St. Louis were filled with accounts of devastation from the Great Fire of 1896's early warnings: extreme heat, unexplained blazes in rural barns, though Benton Creek's troubles seemed smaller, quieter, yet somehow heavier. The Holloways' farm became silent once more until autumn brought strangers who came looking for them. By late September 1895, the leaves around Benton Creek had begun to bronze, curling at the edges from another dry season. A traveling cooper named Nathan Kells stopped by the Holloway place, hoping to trade a barrel hoop or two for lodging. The story of his visit survives only through his later affidavit filed in 1897 when the sheriff reopened the investigation. "The house was not deserted," he wrote, "but felt deserted. The air inside was cooler than outdoors, as though something beneath drew the warmth away." He described finding the parlor neat, a lamp trimmed but unlit, and food still set upon the table, dry yet untouched. In the corner stood a pair of boots, muddied to the ankles. The cellar door was barred from the outside, and the well cover, once solid oak, was missing one hinge. Near its edge lay a kerosene tin turned on its side, and a coil of rope crusted with rust. Kells spent the night in his wagon, uneasy from what he called a pulsing echo that came irregularly from the well around midnight. It was not wind, nor animal, his statement continued, but had the quality of breath. When Constable Rourke revisited the site a month later, he noted in his journal that the Holloway's possessions remained, yet no one had returned. Margaret's ledger was recovered from beneath the kitchen floorboard, where it appeared to have been hidden deliberately. The final entry, dated May 28th, read, "Henry says it is not water, not any longer. I hear voices below, though he says they are ours." Such phrasing puzzled officials, but was later cited by Reverend Callan during a sermon on the sin of pride before nature. County clerks filed the incident as a missing persons case, but rumors outpaced record-keeping. Local children avoided the property. Grown men swore the air around the well carried the smell of iron. Some older residents connected the event to St. Louis's continuing calamities.
Her reports of spontaneous fires and collapses in 1896 lent a broader sense of divine retribution. Missouri's rural papers often paired such tales, linking human misfortune to moral decay. It was said in Benton Creek that Elias Holloway had once worked near the Mississippi waterfront, where the fire would soon rage, and that he brought with him the curse of burned timber. No authority confirmed this, but the story endured. As winter approached, the county sent Deputy Briggs again to seal the well. He found the rope partly submerged and frozen stiff, its fibers hardened by ice. When cut loose, it revealed nothing but blackness below and a faint odor, as from oil or tar. Briggs ordered the opening covered with stones and timber, then filed his last note in the ledger. Well sealed, no further action. He retired 2 years later, telling friends in Moberly that he still dreamed of the humming sound. When spring returned in 1896, Benton Creek's new sheriff, Asa Wendell, reopened the Holloway file after neighboring farmers complained of their livestock straying near the sealed well and refusing to drink from nearby troughs. He brought with him Dr. Horace Winfield of Fayette, a man known for his skeptical temperament and fondness for precise measurement. The two men traveled with a wagon, rope, and an aneroid barometer borrowed from the county schoolhouse to test air pressure near the well site. Winfield's later testimony, given before the county commissioners, noted, "The soil about the well mouth was warmer than the surrounding ground by 2 degrees. A faint vibration noted underfoot, intermittent and irregular." The sheriff's notes, recovered decades later from a courthouse fireproof drawer, record an exchange between the men as the sun set. Winfield remarked, "Sheriff, if your Holloways fell, they fell into more than a hole." That remark spread quickly among locals, who already whispered of an underground chamber below the property. Some said it had been an old storage pit from the war years. Others believed it predated the house entirely. Soon, fragments of correspondence began to surface, letters from Elias Holloway to a supplier in St. Louis, referencing experiments in draft and depth, suggesting he had been testing airflow within the shaft. This caught the attention of a small group of researchers connected to the Missouri Geological Survey, who linked the account loosely to reports surrounding the Great Fire of 1896 in St. Louis, when unexplained atmospheric pressure shifts were noted before the conflagration. They never published their findings, but left notations hinting at a possible link between geological pockets and spontaneous combustion phenomena. In Benton Creek, however, talk of combustion was less scientific than spiritual. Reverend Callan preached that, "The Lord buries pride in stone, so it may hum its warning forever." By midsummer, the sheriff had little more to pursue. His deputy grew ill after spending a single night guarding the property, complaining of chest pains and a metallic taste in his mouth. Winfield wrote to him afterward that he should avoid lingering near the well, for the air is too thick to trust. By July, St. Louis itself was consumed by the historic blaze, and Missouri's attention turned elsewhere. The Holloway case slipped quietly into the stack of unresolved matters, labeled simply missing, presumed relocated. Yet a final note, unsigned, appeared in the county logbook months later, dated December 1896. Light again, visible at depth. Seal disturbed. In early 1897, a thaw loosened much of northern Missouri's frozen soil, and with it came renewed curiosity about the Holloway property. A young surveyor named Lewis P. Carroll petitioned the county for permission to inspect the site,
claiming an interest in mapping subterranean air channels. He was granted limited access, provided he kept written record of his observations. His field journal, later found in the archives at Columbia, recounts a measured calm in his tone, but growing unease in his detail. March 11th. Soil near the well yields a warmth not explained by sun exposure. The timber cover remains intact, yet faint vibration continues when ear is pressed to stone. He returned 2 nights later, accompanied by a local farmhand, Andrew Follett, who refused afterward to speak publicly about what he saw. Caro wrote that, at approximately 10:15 p.m., a low resonance emerged, akin to the sound of a cello string drawn, once then let rest. He lowered a weighted cord, but found no bottom, only resistance as if from liquid too dense to be water. He stopped after 70 feet and sealed his notes in wax. The next morning, he visited the county office and left them with Clerk Merle Haskin, stating he would pursue geological confirmation in Fayette. He never returned. Officially, Caro drowned crossing the Chariton River during spring flooding. His horse was recovered, but not his body. The ledger at the courthouse records his disappearance with 2 lines: "Surveyor lost, presumed accident. May the Lord receive him." In Benton Creek, gossip reignited. Old farmers claimed the ground around the well now steamed lightly at dawn. Others swore they saw faint light pulsing beneath the cracks of the timber cover. One letter published in the Moberly Gazette quoted a witness, Mrs. Ida Fenn, saying, "It flickers like breath under glass." By June, Reverend Callan forbade his congregation to approach the property, calling it earth that prays downward. Around this time, Dr. Winfield reappeared in records, writing privately to a colleague that he'd been consulted by persons claiming new voices heard near the Holloway tract. He dismissed it publicly, but returned to Benton Creek at least once that summer under the guise of field research. His surviving notebook, now held by the State Historical Society, includes a single cryptic entry: "Air at shaft mouth compresses, then exhales." Tone matches that described in St. Louis combustion reports. It was the last record of any official investigation for nearly a decade. By 1904, Benton Creek had shrunk to barely a cluster of homes and a post office. The railroad bypassed it, and travelers rarely mentioned its name except in connection with the old Holloway tract. Few locals remained who remembered the family firsthand, but their story persisted in ledger margins and winter tales told by firelight. Professor Edmund Knoll of the fledgling State Normal School in Kirksville heard one such account while lodging with a former deputy and decided to visit the area for what he called a study in communal memory. Knoll's letters, preserved in an educational archive, reveal his tone to be rational, yet troubled. He wrote that the well lay undisturbed, its cover sunken slightly, moss filling the seams. "The silence," he observed, "is of the sort that presses outward, too complete for comfort." He noted also that the surrounding trees grew in a half-circle, as though nature itself skirted the place. 2 days into his visit, Knoll interviewed a farmer's widow named Delia Harcrow, who recalled seeing lights there years before. "Like someone's lamp left swinging in the dark," she said, "but no one ever came out." Knoll's transcript of her recollection remains one of the few first-hand voices from that period. During his stay, he collected minor artifacts, a rusted hinge, fragments of pottery, and a length of rope still stiff from oil traces, and delivered them to the school's small museum. He speculated that the Holloways might have unearthed natural gas pockets similar to those discussed after the Great Fire of 1896 in St. Louis, when certain investigators blamed vapor seepage for spontaneous ignition. But what unsettled him most was a set of shallow impressions found near the well's edge, too distinct, human in outline, but set deeper than mere prints, as if pressed by weight from beneath. He left Benton Creek the next morning, intending to return with instruments. Never did. A month later, a barn fire destroyed part of the county's storage shed, including Knoll's physical samples. The museum inventory lists them as lost to conflagration. Afterward, no official record refers to the site until 1910, when the land was sold for tax arrears to a family named Brenner. They fenced the area, dismantled the barn, and left the well untouched. According to their grandson's later recollection, the ground there throbbed in summer heat like it still breathed. In 1911, the Brenners' eldest son, Thomas, was preparing the land for early planting when his plow struck something solid about 15 feet from the old well. The horses balked, refusing to move forward, and when the soil was cleared, the boy found not stone, but a section of weathered timber, hand-cut and tarred. The family believed it part of an old cistern and sent word to the county assessor. The report filed under J.H. Daltrey records: substructure beneath surface, dimensions unknown, timber saturated with oil residue, not water. Daltrey ordered it left in place, fearing collapse. Mrs. Brenner later told a neighbor the patch of ground seemed warmer to the hand than the rest of the field. Her comment appeared in a local paper's letter section that June, drawing curious visitors from nearby towns. One, a young newspaperman from Columbia, sketched the scene and wrote a column titled, "The Holloway Well Still Breathes." It ran only once before the editor pulled it after complaints from local clergy who called it irreverent fiction. By autumn that year, the Brenners noticed their animals avoiding the area altogether. Thomas's father filled the depression with loose stone and seeded over it, but the earth sank again within months. They built a fence around both the well and the new hollow, marking it with a simple board that read, "Keep back." Neighbors said they heard tapping sounds from that direction at night, though the Brenners insisted it was just wind through the fence slats. During that winter, Deputy Sheriff Callan, grandson of the same Reverend Callan, conducted a quiet survey after an anonymous letter claimed, "Lights from beneath still glow." His notes, recovered decades later, mention a faint heat rising through the snow. "No open flame," he wrote, "but warmth felt at the palm, pulsing like breath." He compared it to the lingering accounts from St. Louis after the Great Fires of 1896, when residents spoke of ground that smoldered long after the blaze ended. Callan concluded that natural gas seepage might explain the phenomenon, but his closing line hinted otherwise. If gas, it remembers where it came from. In 1914, the Brenners abandoned the farm during drought and debt foreclosure. The property was auctioned to a coal prospecting company that never developed it. In their final correspondence to the county office, Mrs. Brenner wrote simply, "We pray that ground rests." By 1917, the Brenner tract had become overgrown, reclaimed by vines and sumac. The fence half collapsed around the well. The coal company that owned the deed went bankrupt, leaving the site to idleness once again. A few itinerant workers set up a temporary camp there that autumn while surveying new rail lines, but they moved out within a week. One of them, a Czech laborer named Anton Hruby, later gave a statement to the Boone County Constable, claiming he had seen a man's shape standing by the tree line at dusk, head bare, face colorless, and not moving. When he called to it, the shape turned slightly, and then seemed to step behind the trunk without a sound. Hruby insisted it was not imagination. His co-workers found him the next morning packing his tools, unwilling to stay another night. Officially, nothing came of it, but his note survived because the constable copied it into his own journal under odd accounts, not to file. Around the same time, a professor of natural philosophy at Washington University, Dr. Isidore H. Breen, wrote a short paper on rural anomalies in Missouri soils and cited the so-called Holloway well phenomenon as a folk example. He referenced the early reports from the Great Fire of 1896 in St. Louis, noting how heated vapors and electrical discharges may have left permanent alterations in subterranean gases. The paper circulated quietly among academics, but never reached the press. In Benton Creek, the story remained a warning for children. Don't wander near the old fence when the air hums. In 1920, the property briefly appeared again in public record when surveyor Frank L. Mayfield attempted to chart nearby mineral rights. His assistant, a young man named Ellis Rourke, later described hearing rhythmic knocking underfoot while measuring distance from the well.
3 taps, a pause, then 3 more, he told the county clerk, like someone signaling from Yun to ground. Mayfield dismissed it, but noted in his log that the compass needle drifted erratically near the pit. That entry, stored in Jefferson City, is the last technical mention of the Holloway site until the Depression years. Thereafter, the area faded from maps, its boundaries absorbed by larger tracts bought for timber. Only the old road and a few rotted fence posts remained. People in Benton Creek still spoke of lights at night, faint, reddish, wavering like heat over a stove, but most preferred not to look too closely. The township's minutes from 1925 summarize the sentiment neatly. Land unused, story unclosed. By 1928, Benton Creek's name appeared only occasionally in regional papers, mostly for crop prices and flood warnings. Yet travelers along the back road to Moberly still told of the strange hollow where nothing seemed to grow evenly. A letter, preserved in the county correspondence file from that year, came from a teacher named Miss Ruth Denholm, who had stopped with her driver to rest near the ruins of the Brenner farmhouse. She described hearing a low vibration, steady as breathing, that caused the lantern on their buggy to sway slightly, though there was no wind. Her driver refused to wait, insisting that the place watched itself. Denham later wrote that she had researched the Holloway name in courthouse archives and found a baptism record for a single child, Samuel, dated March 1895, with no further trace in census rolls. The name reappeared once more, she noted, scribbled faintly in pencil at the edge of an old supply ledger beside the words, "Gone below." No official response followed her letter, but it was added to the thin file still labeled Holloway Well, Miscellaneous. That summer, heavy rains unearthed parts of the property again. Farmhands hired by a timber company discovered what they thought were animal bones near the sunken fence line. They were small, clean, and brittle. The men buried them nearby without reporting it until one fell ill weeks later, convinced he had breathed the bad air. When word reached Sheriff Wendell's successor, the site was inspected briefly and written off as organic remains of uncertain origin. Still, 2 of the laborers refused to return, claiming they'd seen a reflection moving inside the sealed well as if a lantern burned below. Earlier that same year, an amateur historian from Columbia, Otto Reese, published a pamphlet titled Forgotten Tragedies of the Missouri Frontier. He devoted a section to Benton Creek, recounting the Holloway disappearance and speculating that the family had succumbed to gas asphyxiation from natural vents. He cited the accounts surrounding the Great Fire of 1896 in St. Louis as possible analogues for subterranean ignition, but admitted that no official investigation ever confirmed either heat or flame. Reese's pamphlet sold poorly, but one copy was later found in the Moberly Public Library, annotated in pencil. He doesn't mention the voices. No one ever determined who wrote the note, though the handwriting appeared older, with ink faded almost to gray. During the early 1930s, when the Depression left half of northern Missouri's farms idle, a government soil survey briefly revived interest in the Benton Creek tract. The Works Progress Administration sent 2 men, Joseph Latner and Clyde Ferris, to catalog unused parcels for potential resettlement. Latner's surviving notebook, now brittle and yellow, recorded only 6 lines regarding the Holloway site. Ground uneven, hollow underfoot. Sound like breath in timber pit. Mr. Ferris felt tremor through spade handle. They left the property within an hour, citing unsafe footing. Their supervisor later annotated the page with a single word, unstable, and excluded the parcel from the final report. The locals interpreted the omission differently. Some said the federal men had fled because they'd heard whispering from the stone, a phrase repeated decades later in oral histories collected by the state university. In 1932, an aging Reverend Callan, grandson of the first minister to warn against the well, wrote a private memorandum to his congregation, advising that the area be considered consecrated to silence. He referenced the first fire at St. Louis and the second that burns unseen beneath our fields, an echo of those early Great Fire reports of 1896, when heat seemed to rise from the earth itself. The following winter was hard,
and few dared approach the place except hunters looking for shelter. One such hunter, William Doss, told his wife he had rested by the fence line when he felt a soft pressure at the ground like a bellows pushing from below. He returned home pale, his clothes streaked with ash-like dust, and died of pneumonia 2 weeks later. Doss's neighbor found his journal open to a final entry. The sound is under me again. The county coroner listed natural causes, but the entry was copied into the sheriff's log as a curiosity. For the remainder of the decade, Benton Creek dwindled into little more than a name on survey maps. The well itself vanished beneath creeping vines and soil slides, its location known only through guesswork and the fading memory of old farmers who swore it shifted slightly each year, like it was turning itself in the ground. By 1938, the state reclassified the surrounding land as unfit for agriculture and closed the file on the Holloway property altogether. Yet even then, in letters written by WPA workers, there were notes about the site. The air there too still for birds, the soil warm even under frost, and an occasional faint tapping heard after sundown. By 1940, when the census takers passed through what was left of Benton Creek, they found only 2 inhabited houses along the main road and a handful of collapsed barns. The Holloway tract was marked abandoned, overgrown. That same year, a field inspector for the Missouri Conservation Commission, Edwin L. Moore, was tasked with identifying potential forest renewal zones. He later submitted a report that mentioned the site indirectly under unnamed parcel west of the old creek bed. His notes, preserved in the Commission's archive, contain an odd passage. Observe slight depression where previous well likely stood. Air above cavity strangely warmer despite shade. Tone low, oscillating, measured with pocket watch, 11 seconds per pulse. Moore, a careful and precise man, added no interpretation, only that soil composition differs markedly from adjacent tracts. In 1942, a small detachment of civilian Conservation Corps workers passed through, felling diseased timber for firewood. They set camp a few hundred yards from the old property boundary. On their third night, one worker, James O'Doyle, reported waking to see a dim light through the trees as though a lantern swayed under the earth. He said he heard nothing, yet felt the air moving in and out slow like a sleeper. His foreman dismissed it as fevered imagination brought on by fatigue, but O'Doyle refused to sleep near that spot again. A month later, their crew chief filed a notice stating that one of the workers had gone missing during storm cleanup. The name was never published, and the case never pursued. Wartime shortages made every disappearance easy to lose in paperwork. In the same period, Professor Breen, now retired, wrote his last article reflecting on rural myths of Missouri. He revisited the Holloway story briefly, noting that, from St. Louis to the smallest township, the legacy of fire and air remains misunderstood. He described the well as a symbol of man's intrusion into the unseen pockets beneath his own earth. The article closed with a line that seemed almost confessional. If the ground remembers heat, perhaps it also remembers hunger. After 1945, all surviving records of the Holloway property end. The war shifted every priority, and whatever had lived quietly under the soil was left undisturbed again. Yet locals who grew up in that decade would later tell interviewers that, in high summer, if you stood by the trees where the old fence once ran, the earth would sometimes seem to exhale, a slow breath rising from below, faint but deliberate, as though something still listened from the dark. By the late 1940s, Benton Creek was gone from modern road maps, absorbed into neighboring counties' timberland and watershed reserves. Only hunters and trappers passed through now, leaving the faintest traces of boot prints that the next rain would erase. Records from 1947 mention the purchase of the area by a lumber syndicate out of Kansas City, though no development followed. In the scattered notes of their field engineer, a Mr. C.R. Meldon, appears the only surviving description of the Holloway well in that era. A circle of earth darker than the rest, soft when stepped upon. The old stones beneath crumble inward with hollow sound. The place feels uneasy, as though it remembers being watched. Meldon did not elaborate, but the margin of his notebook bears a sketch,
rough outline of a fence line, the symbol of a well, and curiously, a small cross drawn some distance away marked "Figure seen here." He never included it in his official report, but his widow later donated the book to a local library, where it remains tucked among agricultural surveys. The nearby towns had long forgotten the Holloways, yet stories persisted in passing, of animals that would not cross that shaded ground, of travelers hearing faint tapping like a hand against wood. Missouri's older residents compared it to other rural legends, blending it with memories of the Great Fire of 1896 in St. Louis, that year when the sky itself had glowed red and the earth seemed to breathe smoke. Some said the Holloway land held on to that heat, storing it the way memory holds grief. A single newspaper clipping from 1949, reprinted in the Columbia Evening Tribune, mentioned an unclaimed parcel west of Benton Creek where locals refused to camp due to heat rising from soil. The line was tucked between weather forecasts and a notice for farm equipment. No one pursued it further. By then, only one house remained within sight of two. The old tract. The resident, an elderly woman named Agnes Fenn, claimed her father had been the boy who first saw light in the well in 1895. She told a county interviewer, "It still glows some nights, but faint, like someone trying not to be found." Her words closed the final public record of the Holloway story for nearly half a century. After that, silence. No new ownership filings, no survey updates, no mention in state maps. Just a stretch of woodland, and beneath it a depth no one measured again. By the early 1950s, the Holloway property had blended entirely into the forest canopy, its boundaries forgotten even by the courthouse clerks who once managed its ledgers. Aerial photographs taken for agricultural assessment showed only a depression of darker soil and an irregular clearing where nothing grew higher than waist-deep scrub. It was during this decade that a state survey pilot, Lieutenant Warren L. Gray, noted in his flight log a curious flicker near the timber east of Old Benton Creek, no surface structures visible. His superior dismissed it as light reflection from water, but Gray's report quietly entered the Civil Aeronautics Archive under unresolved visual anomalies. That same summer, a pair of local boys exploring the woods found what they described as a ring of cold stones and an air that smelled like iron. When they returned with friends days later, the stones were covered in moss, and the hollow gone as if filled overnight. The boy's story reached a teacher in Moberly who sent a letter to the Historical Society asking whether the Holloway name still appeared in county rolls. She received no reply. It was only decades later that her letter was found among misplaced correspondence, its ink faded to brown. In those years, Missouri's attention lay elsewhere. The slow modernization of rural towns, the clearing of timber, the memory of war fading. But the Holloway story lingered quietly in oral tradition. Old families repeated fragments, a rope found frozen stiff, a ledger buried beneath floorboards, a woman hearing humming through stone. Few remembered where those lines had come from, only that they were not to be repeated after dark. The last recorded reference from that era came in 1954, when a university geologist, Dr. Lionel Harr, conducted core sampling in northern Randolph County. His notes mention encountering an abrupt thermal anomaly, roughly consist. He went with the old Holloway parcel. He recorded a temperature increase of nearly 6 degrees at shallow depth, and wrote simply, "Possible hydrocarbon pocket or old burn zone." He recommended no further drilling, noting that the soil's interior gives a faint resonance when struck. His findings were quietly filed and never published. Later researchers looking back found the sample labels missing, replaced by a single tag reading, "Discarded. Unstable matter." For a time, it seemed the Holloway ground would finally disappear into silence. Yet field workers in the late 1950s told of a place near Benton Creek where the air grew still and the birds fell quiet, and where, if one pressed an ear to the earth, one might hear, faint and patient, something moving far below. By 1961, Missouri's forests had thickened over the forgotten valley, and only hunters or highway workers occasionally passed through the old Benton Creek routes. One of them,
A survey photographer named Ernest Caldwell left a short report stored in a Department of Transportation file now held in Jefferson City. Site north of Old Creek Line. Sparse growth, center patch bare, circular, air temperature inside circle higher by several degrees. Bird activity ceases when entered. Caldwell, not knowing the land's history, marked it as a possible sinkhole zone, but added one unusual note. Ground emits low hum, detectable only at close range. Frequency, irregular. The memo was never followed up. His assistant later recalled that their camera shutter jammed repeatedly while shooting the site, though it worked elsewhere without issue. That same year, a folklorist from Columbia named Elsie Harcrow began collecting rural ghost tales for a student project. She interviewed elderly residents across Randolph County and eventually recorded the story of the Holloways from a man who claimed his grandfather had sealed the well in 1895. He told her, "The earth there remembers what it swallowed." Harcrow transcribed his words, but marked the entry as legend, placing it between stories of phantom trains and lost burial grounds. She never published her paper, but the reel-to-reel recording survived. When played years later, a faint droning sound can be heard under the speaker's voice, a tone neither constant nor mechanical. Some audio engineers attributed it to tape degradation, but others, after spectral analysis, noted it fluctuated roughly every 11 seconds, identical to the rhythm noted by Edwin Moore in 1940. By the late 1960s, the Holloway tract was again sold, this time to a private timber investor who cleared several acres before halting work. His foreman filed a brief complaint with the county, citing soft terrain unsuitable for machinery and uneven heat emission from soil. He also mentioned that during excavation, one bulldozer sank nearly a foot into loose earth that smelled faintly of kerosene. The work was stopped and the clearing left unseeded. In letters between the investor and the county assessor, the site is referred to as the breathing pit, a phrase that quietly revived the old legend for a new generation of locals, though few spoke of it directly. They simply avoided the road leading east of the creek when dusk fell. By 1972, the story of the Holloway well had drifted into near myth, carried mostly by aging farmers who used it as a cautionary tale for children wandering too far into the woods. A feature writer from the Kansas City Star, Hal Minter, stumbled across those accounts while compiling a column on forgotten Missouri towns. He visited Benton Creek's remains that summer, finding only a dirt trail and, at its end, a depression filled with reeds and half-collapsed stones. Minter's article, printed that August under the heading "The Ground That Breathes," described a steady warmth rising from beneath the soil and a smell like old oil. He mentioned briefly the connection to the Great Fire of 1896 in St. Louis, reminding readers how the earth there once smoldered long after the flames went out. Perhaps, he wrote, some parts of Missouri never cooled. Within a week, the paper received letters from locals who insisted Minter had exaggerated. Others wrote to say they had felt the same heat when passing through the valley decades earlier. Minter ignored the correspondence, but one letter, unsigned, arrived written in a shaky hand. "You heard it too, didn't you?" The envelope bore no return address and smelled faintly of smoke. Minter kept it pinned to his office wall until his death 10 years later. In 1975, state environmental officers performed limited drilling tests for groundwater along the old timber tract. One entry in their field log describes unexpected methane presence at shallow depth, and notes that the bore collapsed inward with low acoustic discharge, pop or sigh. The crew abandoned further tests, concluding that the subsoil was volatile and unpredictable. They fenced the area, leaving behind a weathered sign that read, "Hazard, no entry." A year later, hikers reported seeing that same sign warped and blackened as if by heat, though no fire had been recorded nearby. By then, almost no one remembered the Holloway name, yet among longtime residents of Randolph County, there lingered a phrase muttered only half-jokingly, "When the ground breathes, keep walking." During the late 1970s, Construction surveyors from Columbia documented a steady rise in ground temperature near the old creek line, 6 to 8 degrees higher than surrounding land. Their instruments also recorded intermittent low-frequency vibrations repeating roughly every 11 seconds, the same pattern once noted by Moore, by Harcro's recording, and perhaps even by that first constable who heard a hum through stone. In 1981, a pair of graduate students from the University of Missouri's Geology Department conducted a quiet field study on the Benton Creek tract, unaware of its local reputation. Their goal was to measure residual heat zones from defunct coal seams. They camped for 2 nights near the overgrown depression once marked as the Holloway Well. In their first report, later recovered from university archives, student Robert Mears wrote, "Ground temperature abnormally elevated by 9 degrees, air perfectly still, odor of rust." His partner, Evelyn Shore, noted that their magnetic compass malfunctioned repeatedly within a 10-foot radius, and that a low tremor persisted beneath the soil surface, rhythmic, faint, measurable. They assumed mechanical interference and logged the anomaly without comment. That second night, Mears claimed he awoke to a sound like distant wind under pressure, though no breeze moved through the camp. He described it as a deep exhale that grew stronger near dawn. Shore's field notebook ends mid-sentence. Air shifted, felt as though coming up from... The remainder of the page is smeared, the ink dissolved by moisture. Both students returned unharmed, but within weeks their supervising professor halted the project, citing equipment loss and crew disquiet. No explanation was filed. In 1983, when county engineers surveyed the region for a possible flood control reservoir, they discovered the same track still warm and uneven. The report called it thermal anomaly of non-industrial origin, but the project was shelved after budget cuts. Years later, one of the engineers, Leland Pryor, told a journalist that while marking grid lines, he had seen a faint shimmer between the trees, as if light moved beneath the ground. He admitted it might have been heat distortion, but added quietly, "It felt like someone breathing right under my boots." Throughout the 1980s, the story resurfaced in small circles of Missouri folklore enthusiasts who linked it back to the 1890s vanishings. The Great Fire of 1896 in St. Louis returned as their reference point, a reminder of how certain flames never fully die, only bury themselves deeper. When locals spoke of the Holloway Well, they no longer mentioned water at all. They spoke of depth, of sound, and of warmth that pulsed slow as a heartbeat beneath the Missouri soil. In 1988, an independent documentary filmmaker named Paul Danner arrived in Randolph County with a small crew, hoping to record rural legends for a public television series. His notes later surfaced in the Missouri Historical Society under the heading Unfinished Project, Benton Creek segment. Danner's team spent 2 days filming interviews with older residents who still remembered faint details of the Holloway case. One woman recalled that her father's friend had found a rope burned clean through at both ends near the site decades earlier. Another said she'd seen blue light in the trees, like lightning held too long. On the final evening, the crew visited the overgrown clearing itself. Danner wrote in his production journal, "We set a tripod roughly where the well once stood. The air is still. No wind, no insects. Sound equipment picking up sub-bass vibration feels rhythmic." The next line reads simply, "Temperature at soil surface 92 degrees, ambient 78 degrees, smell of iron and rain." Footage recovered from that night shows the camera shaking slightly, though the operator's voice insists he wasn't moving. A distant thud echoes once, followed by what the sound engineer later described as air collapsing inward. When they reviewed the tapes back in Columbia, the audio track contained a low hum repeating every 11 seconds, the same pattern documented since 1895. Danner shelved the project, claiming he'd lost funding, though colleagues remembered him as withdrawn afterward. He died of heart failure 5 years later. His unfinished film remained in storage until the early 2000s, when an archivist rediscovered it and noted that several frames appeared overexposed, as if by internal light. not sun flare. By the early 1990s, the tract was under private conservation, closed to the public. A ranger's memo dated 1993 refers to reports of trespassers near the old fenced area, claiming to hear voice. Yes, the ranger dismissed it, but included one odd observation. Evening ground mist forms only over that one patch, circular, warm to touch. In that same year, a university research assistant attempting to map mineral seams included a line in her field notes referencing residual fire vapor near Benton Creek, similar to gas pockets recorded after the Great Fire of 1896 in St. Louis. It was the last official mention linking the two phenomena, though many later speculated that both shared the same underground source, a breath ancient and unseen, still rising from Missouri's quiet soil. By 1999, the Holloway tract was surrounded by second-growth forest so thick that even county rangers seldom entered it. A state boundary survey that spring rediscovered the perimeter fence, 3 posts still upright, others swallowed by vines. A geologist named Marie Eldon accompanied the crew, curious about old records of thermal pockets. Her log from April 17th notes, soil unusually soft, temperature variance 8 degrees, faint metallic odor persisting. She added, almost as an afterthought, ground emits low sound, steady, beneath threshold of hearing, but felt through feet. That entry never reached the formal report, replaced instead by the phrase, conditions normal. A year later, Eldon privately sent her data to a colleague at Washington University, speculating that heat-trapping caverns beneath Benton Creek may date to earlier combustion strata, perhaps relics from events noted during the Great Fire of 1896. Her colleague replied that the idea was intriguing but unprovable, as no bore logs or geological records existed for that precise location. The exchange ended there. During that same season, 2 hikers exploring old trails nearby claimed to have seen movement like shadow under leaves, something dark that passed from tree to tree without wind. Their story circulated briefly on local message boards before fading. A decade of silence followed until a conservation officer in 2009 mentioned the site again after a brush fire swept the area. He described a burning smell without visible flame and a slow exhale from the ground as if from a furnace. The fire extinguished itself within hours, leaving soil blackened but trees intact. When investigators tested the ash, they found traces of kerosene-like residue and elevated carbon readings inconsistent with surface burns. No cause was determined. In the years that followed, the story of the Holloway well resurfaced in online forums devoted to forgotten American mysteries. Some writers speculated that the family had tapped into a natural vent of combustible gas. Others claimed the earth itself had swallowed them whole. Yet among Missouri's older residents, the tale was spoken quietly, as though still under oath, how in the summer heat, when the air goes still, the ground there breathes and hums, counting time in slow living pulses. By the summer of 2013, the name Benton Creek appeared only in archival databases and the memories of local historians. The forest had reclaimed the valley. Deer paths crossed where fences once stood, and the depression that marked the old well lay buried under layers of leaves and silt. That year, a graduate researcher from Columbia named Daniel Rowe began cataloging lost settlements for his thesis on rural abandonment. He found the Holloway records by accident, 2 misfiled ledgers, and an unsigned affidavit from 1897 referring to light seen within sealed shaft. Intrigued, Rowe traveled to the approximate coordinates and camped one night on the ridge above the creek. He later recounted to colleagues that the air was strangely warm and that his compass ticked faintly, moving a single degree back and forth as if breathing. He wrote in his field notes, "Forest quiet beyond expectation. No insects, no wind. The ground holds heat." He stayed only until dawn. The next morning he discovered faint circular indentations in the soil, wide as footprints, yet pressed deeper than human weight. He returned to town and never revisited the site, but his notes became part of a 2015 academic paper on psychogeographic residues in abandoned settlements. In the final paragraph he wrote, "The Holloway tract illustrates how memory persists within land itself, where repetition of natural rhythm mimics the measure of human fear." Since then, no sanctioned survey has been made. The forest continues to thicken, each season layering more distance between modern Missouri and that single patch of restless soil. Some hikers claim their compasses falter near the old creek bed. Others say that at night a warmth rises through the roots, steady and faint, like a sigh beneath the ground. And on certain still evenings, when the crickets fall silent and the air turns heavy, those who walk alone in that part of Randolph County swear they hear the earth breathe, slowly, evenly, as though keeping time for those it once took and never returned. The Holloway name has long vanished from public record, yet its place remains, buried beneath oak and vine, the hum perhaps weaker now, but never gone. No light glows there anymore, only the whisper of soil settling deeper, guarding whatever secret Missouri chose to keep.